Among the forgotten court documents of Natchez, Mississippi, there exists a marriage certificate dated March 1851 that has puzzled historians for over a century. The bride was listed as property 6 months before the wedding. The groom owned 37 human beings. What happened between those 6 months defies every social law of the antebellum South, yet the evidence suggests it actually occurred. Local archives reveal that within a single year, this woman went from sleeping in slave quarters to signing her name in the master's bedroom. And the path she took involved every unmarried man on that property. The community that witnessed this transformation kept silent for decades, but the truth was preserved in letters, diaries, and testimony that paint a picture so calculated, so methodical that modern readers struggle to believe one person could orchestrate such manipulation. Before we continue with the story of Rose Chano and the Bell Point Plantation, if stories of calculated survival and dangerous ambition intrigue you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next investigation into America's darkest chapters. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We love knowing where our audience connects with these forgotten tales. What Rose accomplished in those months would require a mind as sharp as any strategist's and a will strong enough to risk everything for a chance at freedom that shouldn't have been possible. The Bell Point Plantation sprawled across 12,200 acres of prime Mississippi Delta land, its cotton fields extending like wide oceans when harvest season approached. The main house stood 3 stories tall with columns that caught the morning sun and cast long shadows across the formal gardens where magnolia trees bloomed with suffocating sweetness. By 1850, Bell Point was one of the most profitable operations in Adams County, producing over 400 bales of cotton annually under the ownership of Thomas Belelmont, a widower of 38 who had inherited the estate from his father 5 years earlier. Thomas had a reputation for efficiency rather than cruelty. He ran Bell Point like a business, maintaining detailed ledgers that tracked every pound of cotton, every tool, every expense. His enslaved workforce numbered 37 people, and unlike some neighboring plantations, where overseers ruled with whips and terror, Thomas preferred a system of measured discipline and calculated incentives. Those who exceeded their picking quotas received Sunday privileges. Those who caused trouble found themselves sold downriver to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where life expectancy measured in years rather than decades. The white men of Bell Point formed a small hierarchy beneath Thomas. There was Hugh Carpenter, the overseer, a lean man of 42 from Georgia with sun-damaged skin and eyes that missed nothing in the fields. Samuel Pwitt managed the stables and livestock, a position of relative prestige that came with a private cottage near the barn. James Farley oversaw the cotton gin and press, his hands perpetually stained with the oil and dust of machinery. Clayton Webb served as the plantation's bookkeeper and occasional tutor to Thomas's young nephew, who visited each summer. Finally, there was Martin Jessup, who supervised the house servants and managed Bell Point's interactions with merchants in Natchez, a position that required literacy and a presentable appearance. Each of these men lived in separate cottages scattered around the plantation's perimeter, far enough from the main house to maintain social distinction, but close enough to respond when Thomas required their services. None of them were married, a curious fact in a region where most white men sought wives by their mid-20s. Hugh had been widowed. Samuel claimed he preferred bachelorhood. James had a sweetheart in Natchez who refused to live on a plantation. Clayton considered himself too bookish for matrimony. Martin simply never found anyone suitable. Into this world of rigid hierarchies and unspoken rules, Rose arrived in late 1849 as part of an estate sale. She was 19 years old, purchased for $800 from a failing plantation near Vicksburg. The bill of sale described her as healthy, literate, skilled in household tasks, light-complexioned. That last detail mattered in the complex racial calculus of the Deep South. Rose's grandmother had been the mixed-race daughter of a Virginia planter, making Rose what was delicately termed pashtas in the racial classifications of the time, legally enslaved but possessing features that complicated the simple black and white categories some preferred. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, which was considerable height for a woman of that era. Her face had the kind of symmetry that drew attention without being overtly striking. But it was her eyes that people remembered, dark and direct, with an intensity that suggested thoughts moving behind them at a speed most couldn't follow. She had learned to read and write at her previous plantation, taught secretly by the owner's daughter, who'd felt charitable before her father discovered the lessons and sold Rose to eliminate the problem. Thomas assigned Rose to work in the main house under the supervision of Dinah, the 60-year-old woman who'd served as head house servant since Thomas's childhood. Danina ran the domestic operations with military precision, managing a staff of 6 who cooked, cleaned, laundered, and maintained the appearance of genteel southern living that Belle Pointe's reputation required. Rose learned quickly that Dinah tolerated no inefficiency, no gossip, and absolutely no interaction with the white men beyond what duties required. "You keep your eyes down and your mouth shut," Dinah told Rose on her first day, showing her how to properly polish the silver. "Mr. Thomas runs a respectable house, and that means we don't give nobody reason to talk. You understand me?" Rose understood perfectly. She also understood that the rules Dinah outlined were less about protection than control. Over her first months at Belle Pointe, Rose observed the plantation's social ecosystem with the attention of someone studying a foreign language. She noticed how Hugh, the overseer, drank alone each evening on his cottage porch. She observed Samuel's frustration when a prize may died foeing, how he cursed the unfairness of losing something he'd spent months preparing for profit. She watched James waste his Sundays reading agricultural journals, dreaming of owning his own land someday. She saw how Clayton's hands trembled slightly when Thomas criticized errors in the account books. She registered Martin's pride in his appearance, his careful grooming, his obvious desire to be seen as more than merely an employee, and she noticed how each of them looked at her when they thought she wasn't paying attention. The spring of 1850 brought unusual heat to the Delta. By April, temperatures reached levels typically reserved for July, and the early cotton planting proceeded under a sun that felt like judgment. Thomas spent more time in Natchez on business, leaving Hugh to manage the fields. It was during one of these absences that Rose made her first calculated move. Hugh Carpenter had developed a routine. Each evening after the field hands returned to their quarters, he would walk the property line, checking fences, ostensibly inspecting for damage, but really just burning off the day's tensions with movement. He always carried a flask of whiskey, taking measured sips that added up over the 2-hour walk. By the time he returned to his cottage, he was neither drunk nor sober, existing in that pleasant middle state where the day's harshness softened into something manageable. On a Thursday evening in late April, Rose intercepted him along the eastern fence line. She'd planned the timing carefully. After Thomas's departure for a 3-day trip to New Orleans, after Danina had retired with one of her headaches, after the other house servants had retreated to their quarters, Rose had claimed she needed to retrieve herbs from the kitchen garden near where Hugh would pass. She wore a simple gray dress that Dinah insisted on for house servants, but she'd let down her hair from its usual tight bun, and she'd positioned herself where the setting sun would backlight her figure against the fence rails. "Evening, Mr. Carpenter," she said when he approached, her voice carrying just enough warmth to not be purely respectful, but not enough to be overtly familiar. Hugh stopped, surprised to see anyone in this section at this hour. "Rose?" He nodded, already moving to walk past. "Mighty hot today," she continued, stepping slightly into his path, but making it seem accidental. "I brought some mint tea from the kitchen, been cooling in the spring house. Thought you might appreciate something cold after your walk." She produced a tin cup from behind the fence post where she'd hidden it. Hugh's eyes moved from the cup to her face, calculating. He was a man who'd survived 42 years by recognizing traps. "That's thoughtful," he said slowly, "but I don't think Dinah would approve of you being out here alone with me." "Dinah's sleeping off a headache," Rose replied. "And I'm not doing anything wrong. Just being Christian-like, offering refreshment." She held the cup closer. "Unless you're too proud to accept kindness from someone like me." The challenge in that last phrase made Hugh's jaw tighten. Rose had identified his weakness in her observations. Hugh Carpenter had never recovered from his wife's death 6 years earlier, and he resented that his grief had calcified into permanent isolation. The implication that he was too proud, too high, too separate, struck exactly the nerve she'd intended. He took the cup. The tea was genuinely cold, sweet with honey, perfect for the oppressive heat. "Thank you," he said, draining half of it. "That's real kind." "You look tired," Rose observed, and there was genuine sympathy in her voice now. "Must be hard managing everything when Mr. Belmont's away. All those people depending on you getting things right." Hugh studied her face, searching for manipulation but finding what appeared to be honest understanding. "It's work," he admitted, "same as anything else." They talked for 20 minutes standing by that fence. Rose asked intelligent questions about cotton cultivation, about the challenges of managing field hands, about Hugh's past in Georgia. She listened with complete attention, the kind of focused interest that lonely people starve for. She didn't flirt. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she offered something more dangerous, understanding. When Hugh finally continued to his cottage, he felt lighter than he had in months, and when Rose returned to the main house, she wore a small smile that would have terrified Dina if the older woman had seen it. Segunda CTA engagement. What Rose had started that evening would spiral into something that would change the entire structure of Bell Point Plantation. If you're already captivated by how calculated this manipulation was, hit that like button and leave a comment with your theory. How far do you think Rose could really go with this plan? The truth is more methodical than you might imagine. Over the next month, Rose engineered 4 more accidental encounters with Hugh. Each time she varied her approach. Sometimes she brought food. Sometimes she simply happened to be walking the same direction. Once she asked his advice about a supposedly sick chicken. The pattern was subtle enough that Hugh never felt pursued, yet consistent enough that he began to anticipate these interactions. She learned his vulnerabilities with the precision of a surgeon mapping anatomy. Hugh's loneliness ran deeper than he admitted to himself. His wife had died in childbirth along with their son, and he'd never forgiven himself for failing to afford a better doctor. He'd taken the overseer position at Bell Point to escape George's memories, but isolation had followed him like a shadow. When Rose listened to him describe his late wife, she didn't offer empty sympathy. She simply let him talk, and her silence felt like absolution. "You're easy to talk to," Hugh said one evening in mid-May. They were sitting on a bench near the kitchen garden, close enough to the main house that their interaction could be explained if anyone asked, far enough to feel private. "Most people hear what they want to hear. You actually listen." "My mama used to say, listening is how you learn who people really are," Rose replied. It was true. Her mother had said that, though the context had been teaching Rose how to survive in a world designed to deny her humanity. "You're a good man, Mr. Carpenter, trying to do right in a situation that's often wrong." The validation struck Hugh hard. He'd spent years justifying his role as overseer, telling himself he was more humane than alternatives, that someone had to manage the system, even if the system itself was rotten. Hearing Rose, an enslaved woman, call him good-released, something knotted in his chest. That night, when Rose suggested they move their conversation somewhere more private, Hugh's resistance crumbled. His cottage was modest but clean, and what happened there was neither violent nor romantic. It was transactional, though Hugh would convince himself otherwise in the weeks that followed. Rose gave him physical comfort wrapped in emotional validation, and Hugh gave her the protection of his discretion and a dangerous new status. By June, Hugh Carpenter believed himself in love with Rose. Though he would never have used that word, he believed he was helping her, protecting her from the harshness of fieldwork by ensuring she remained assigned to the house. He gave her small gifts, a ribbon, a bar of good soap, coins she could hide for some imagined future. He talked to her about his dreams of saving enough money to buy a small farm of his own, somewhere far from the plantation system. He never quite included her in these fantasies explicitly, but the implication hung between them. Rose listened, encouraged, and carefully noted every detail he revealed about Bell Point's operations, about Thomas Bellamont's habits, about the other white men on the property. Samuel Puit, the stablemaster, required a different approach. Rose observed that Samuel's attachment wasn't to a lost past like Hugh's, but to an imagined future. He was 36 and obsessed with proving himself capable of more than managing horses. He read books about animal husbandry and dreamed of breeding a strain of horses that would make his reputation. His cottage walls were covered with sketches of bloodlines and breeding charts. Rose's opportunity came when Thomas purchased a new breeding mare at considerable expense. The mare arrived temperamental and dangerous, having been mistreated at her previous stable. Samuel spent weeks trying to gentle her with limited success, and his frustration mounted as Thomas's expectations for offspring from this expensive animal grew clearer. Rose had grown up around horses at her previous plantation. She knew their temperaments, understood their fear responses. One afternoon in early July, she approached Samuel at the stable with a suggestion so casual it seemed almost innocent. "My grandfather used to work with difficult horses," she said, watching him struggle with the mare's halter. "Said the trick was making them think gentling was their idea, not yours. You stop pulling, they stop fighting." Samuel looked at her skeptically. "Your grandfather a stable hand?" "Master's carriage driver," Rose replied. 50 years working with horses. Taught me some before he died." This was partly true. Her grandfather had driven carriages, though Rose's knowledge came more from observation than direct instruction. "What would you suggest?" Samuel asked, desperate enough to consider advice from someone the plantation system said he shouldn't value. Rose demonstrated a technique using steady pressure and release, speaking to the mayor in low tones, never directly confronting her resistance. Within 20 minutes, the mayor accepted a halter she'd fought against for weeks. Samuel stared in astonishment. "How did you?" "You were trying to dominate her," Rose explained. "Sometimes you get further by making them feel safe than by making them feel beaten." The metaphor wasn't lost on Samuel, though he didn't consciously recognize it. Over the following weeks, Rose helped him with the mayor during hours when other tasks brought her legitimately near the stables. She proved invaluable. The mayor, who'd seemed unmanageable, became workable, then cooperative, then eventually pregnant, with what Samuel hoped would be valuable foes. Samuel's gratitude transformed into dependence. He began to see Rose as essential to his success, to his dream of proving himself capable of more than his current position. When Rose suggested that her knowledge could help with other horses, other breeding decisions, Samuel eagerly agreed. And when their interactions shifted from professional to personal, Samuel convinced himself it was mutual attraction rather than calculated seduction. By August, Rose had secured Samuel's protection and access to the stables, a privilege that would prove crucial later. She also gained something more valuable. Samuel talked openly about plantation business, about Thomas's financial pressures, about debts and investments, and the precarious economics that kept Bell Point profitable. James Farley proved the most challenging. The gin overseer was 39 and deeply religious, a Methodist who read scripture each night and attended services in Natchez every Sunday. He carried guilt about his role in the plantation system like a physical weight. Convinced that his participation in slavery was a sin he'd answer for in eternity. He dealt with this guilt through compartmentalization. The enslaved workers at the gin were responsibilities, not people. A mental trick that let him function. Rose recognized that James couldn't be seduced through loneliness or ambition. His vulnerability was his guilt and his desperate need for absolution. She found him one Sunday afternoon in August reading his Bible on the bench outside the gin, sweat-stained from the week's work despite his day of rest. She approached carefully, carrying nothing, offering nothing except her presence. "Excuse me, Mr. Farley. I wonder if you might help me understand something I read." James looked up, surprised. "You read?" "Yes, sir. Taught myself letters at my previous place. Been reading the Bible when I can find one." This was true. Rose had indeed learned to read biblical passages, recognizing that literacy was a weapon in a world that tried to deny it to people like her. That's admirable," James said, and meant it. "What passage troubles you?" Rose quoted from Philion, the short letter where Paul urges a slave owner to accept back a runaway slave not as property, but as a brother. "It seems like Paul's saying something about how Christians should treat the enslaved," Rose said carefully. "But I don't understand what he means. If we're all brothers in Christ, what does that mean for arrangements like Bell Point?" The question struck at the heart of James's tortured conscience. He spent an hour explaining interpretations, defenses, justifications, all while Rose listened with apparent genuine interest in his theology. She didn't argue. That would have ended the conversation. Instead, she asked questions that forced James to confront contradictions in his own reasoning. Over subsequent weeks, their theological discussions became regular Sunday events. James began to see Rose as a soul-seeking salvation, someone whose intelligence and spiritual hunger deserved nurturing despite her legal status. He loaned her his Bible, then other books from his small library. He taught her arithmetic, ostensibly so she could better understand scriptural numerology. The shift from spiritual mentorship to physical relationship happened in September, and James immediately drowned in guilt. But Rose had positioned herself carefully. She assured him that their connection was about mutual comfort, not sin. She quoted scripture about human weakness and divine forgiveness. She became his confessor even as she became his secret companion. James's guilt made him generous. He gave Rose books, time, protection from harder work assignments. He also inadvertently gave her education. Through their conversations, Rose learned about contracts, about law, about the mechanisms of property and ownership that governed her existence. Clayton Webb, the bookkeeper, was 32, and possessed the kind of nervous intelligence that creates both brilliance and constant anxiety. He lived in fear of making errors in Thomas's account books, of miscalculating in ways that might cost him his position. His cottage was obsessively organized, every paper filed, every surface clean. He had no family, no close friends, no life beyond the ledgers that consumed his days. Rose understood that Clayton needed competence, not comfort. She began by asking him questions about numbers, claiming she wanted to understand accounting to potentially help with household budgets. Clayton, starved for someone who appreciated his skills, eagerly taught her basic bookkeeping. Rose proved an exceptional student. She absorbed principles quickly, understood double-entry systems, grasped concepts that many educated men struggled with. Clayton's fear of inadequacy transformed into pride at having discovered such an apt pupil. He began showing her Thomas's actual accounts, explaining plantation economics in detail. "Most people don't understand the margins we work with," Clayton explained one evening in October, his anxiety temporarily forgotten in the pleasure of having an interested audience. One bad crop, one drop in cotton prices, and operations like Bell Point can collapse. Mr. Belmont is leveraged far more than most know. 3 different loans secured against future harvests. This information was gold. Rose filed it away, understanding that knowledge of Thomas's financial pressures might prove crucial. She also allowed Clayton to believe he was helping her, elevating her, giving her tools to survive in a system designed to keep her powerless. Their relationship became physical in late October, initiated by Rose during a moment when Clayton's anxiety had crested into near panic over a miscalculation in the quarterly accounts. Rose calmed him, validated him, made him feel competent and valued. Clayton fell into desperate gratitude. Martin Jessup, the house steward, was the most dangerous target. At 35, Martin prided himself on being more refined than the other white employees. He dressed carefully, spoke correctly, and maintained rigid social boundaries. He saw himself as fundamentally superior to both the field hands he supervised and the rougher white men he worked alongside. His weakness was vanity, and his terror of being seen as common. Rose waited until November to approach Martin, and she did it through fashion. She altered her appearance subtly, better posture, more careful grooming, an adjustment to her head wrap that suggested style rather than simple utility. When Martin noticed and complimented her presentation, Rose thanked him and asked advice about proper deportment. "I've watched how you carry yourself, Mr. Jessup," she said. "You have a refinement the others lack. I wonder if you might teach me how to present myself with similar grace." The appeal to Martin's vanity worked perfectly. He began instructing Rose on etiquette, on proper speech patterns, on the subtle social signals that separated the refined from the crude. Rose played the eager student, mirroring his manner, adopting his speech patterns, becoming a reflection of what Martin imagined himself to be. Martin's attraction grew from seeing himself reflected back. When Rose suggested that someone of his obvious quality deserved companionship with a woman who could appreciate refinement, Martin's vanity overcame his social programming. Their relationship began in December, and Martin convinced himself that he'd elevated Rose, that their connection proved his sophisticated ability to recognize quality regardless of legal status. By Christmas of 1850, Rose had achieved something unprecedented at Bell Point. She had intimate relationships with all 5 white men who managed the plantation's operations, and none of them knew about the others. Each believed himself special, unique in his connection to her. Each protected her in different ways. Hugh ensured her house assignment remained secure. Samuel gave her access to the stables and transportation knowledge. James provided education and books. Clayton shared financial information. Martin elevated her status within the house hierarchy. Rose had transformed herself from property into someone with leverage, with knowledge, with multiple men who would defend her interests without understanding they were being manipulated. But this was only the foundation. What Rose planned next would require perfect timing and nerves most people couldn't imagine possessing. Thomas Belmont returned from an extended January trip to New Orleans with news that would destabilize Bell Point's careful equilibrium. Cotton prices had dropped significantly due to oversupply in British markets. The loans Clayton had mentioned were coming due, and Thomas needed to restructure his debts or risk losing sections of the plantation. He called a meeting of his management staff in his study, and the tension in that room was thick enough to taste. "We need to increase efficiency," Thomas announced, his finger tapping the account books Clayton had prepared. 20% more production with no increase in expenses. That means longer days, stricter quotas, and potentially selling off assets that aren't performing. Hugh shifted uncomfortably. The field hands are already working sunrise to sunset. Then they work faster, Thomas replied. And we sell anyone who can't keep pace. I can get decent prices for young males at the Natchez market. Replace them with cheaper labor, Samuel spoke up. What about the breeding program? The mayor finally took. The horse program is a luxury we can't afford right now, Thomas interrupted. Sell the mare and foal when it comes. Focus on essentials. Clayton's hands trembled as he made notes. James stared at his own reflection in the window glass. Martin maintained his carefully neutral expression, but his jaw tightened. Rose, serving coffee in the corner, as house servants did during such meetings, absorbed every word. Thomas's financial desperation was worse than Clayton had known. The plantation was on a knife's edge, and desperate men made rash decisions. After the meeting, Rose sat in her small room in the servants' quarters and calculated her next moves with the cold precision of a chessmaster planning an endgame. She had gathered pieces, the 5 white men's dependents, Thomas's financial vulnerability, her own hard-won literacy and knowledge. Now she needed to arrange them into something that could break the fundamental law of Southern society, that she was property, not a person. The plantation system rested on rigid boundaries. White over black, male over female, owner over owned. Breaking any of these boundaries drew violent reprisal, but Rose had identified something most people missed. The system's rigidity was also its weakness. When pressure built against inflexible structures, they didn't bend, they shattered. Her plan was audacious and required perfect execution. First, she needed to destabilize the relationships between Thomas and his managers. Second, she needed to make herself indispensable to Thomas specifically. Third, she needed legal documentation that would survive challenges. And fourth, she needed all of this to happen before Thomas sold her or anyone else discovered her web of manipulations. She started with the accounts. Through Clayton, she'd learned that Thomas's bookkeeping had small but consistent errors. Nothing major, but enough that the true financial picture was slightly obscured. Rose suggested to Clayton that she help him review the ledgers for accuracy, claiming she wanted to practice her arithmetic skills. Clayton, already dependent on her validation, agreed. Working together late at night in his cottage, Rose helped Clayton discover the errors. Clayton discovered errors she'd actually identified weeks earlier, but kept quiet about. When Clayton presented corrected figures to Thomas, they showed the plantation situation was even worse than believed. Thomas exploded at Clayton for the mistakes. Clayton, humiliated and defensive, mentioned that he'd been working with Rose to improve accuracy. Thomas, desperate for any solution to his financial crisis, summoned Rose to explain. Clayton says, "You have a head for numbers." Thomas said, studying Rose across his desk. It was the first time they'd spoken directly beyond simple instructions. "That true?" "I learned quickly, sir," Rose replied carefully. "Mr. Webb has been kind enough to teach me basic bookkeeping. I found several discrepancies he'd missed." Thomas tested her with several calculations. Rose answered immediately. Correctly. Thomas's eyebrows raised. "Where did you learn to calculate like that?" "Practice, sir. And necessity. If you understand numbers, you understand how things really work." The conversation lasted 30 minutes. By the end, Thomas had made a decision that would have scandalized his neighbors if they'd known. He assigned Rose to assist Clayton with the plantation accounts. The arrangement made practical sense. Rose worked for no extra wages. She was already literate, and Thomas needed accurate financial information desperately, but the assignment gave Rose something far more valuable than Thomas realized. She now had legitimate access to every aspect of Bell Point's operations, to the legal documents that governed the plantation, to the contracts and loans and property deeds that structured Thomas's entire world, to Sarah C. Tia compartiment. Just when we thought we'd seen the extent of Rose's manipulation, she gains access to the very documents that define her enslavement. If this story is giving you chills at how calculated every move has been, share this video with a friend who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens when an enslaved woman learns to read the contracts that own her. February 1851 brought unseasonable cold to Mississippi. Ice formed on water troughs, and the enslaved workers suffered in quarters inadequately heated for such weather. Thomas grudgingly approved extra firewood, conscious that dead workers couldn't produce cotton, but the cold provided Rose with another opportunity. She was in Thomas's study late one evening, helping Clayton reconcile accounts when Thomas entered unexpectedly. Clayton immediately tensed, but Thomas ignored him and addressed Rose directly. I need your opinion on something, Thomas said, which was remarkable. Plantation owners didn't ask enslaved people's opinions. Hugh says we need new plows for spring planting. James wants to upgrade the gin machinery. Samuel wants breeding stock. I can afford one maybe. Which investment gives me the best return? Rose didn't answer immediately. She looked at the account books at the figures she'd memorized and calculated. None of them, sir. Thomas frowned. What? Your debt structure has you paying 18% interest on the primary loan, Rose explained. Any investment that returns less than 18% loses money. Plows might increase harvest by 10%. Gin machinery may be 12. Breeding stock takes years for return. You'd get better return paying down the high-interest debt first than investing from a stronger position. The silence stretched. Clayton stared at Rose like she'd sprouted wings. Thomas's face was unreadable. For a long moment, Rose thought she'd miscalculated, overstepped, revealed too much intelligence for a system that punished intellectual equality. Then Thomas laughed. A short, sharp sound. You're right, Clayton. Why didn't you tell me that? Clayton stammered something about waiting for the right moment. Thomas waved him off and looked at Rose with new interest. You're wasted on housework, he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly, more an acknowledgement of inefficiency, which to Thomas amounted to the same thing. Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas consulted Rose frequently on financial decisions. He never acknowledged the strangeness of seeking business advice from someone he legally owned. He simply recognized competence and used it, the same pragmatic approach he applied to any resource. But each consultation gave Rose more insight into Thomas's thinking, his pressures, his vulnerabilities. She learned that Thomas's largest creditor was a New Orleans banker named Rousseau, who held mortgages on half the plantations in the Delta. She learned that Thomas's marriage prospects were complicated by his debts. No respectable family would marry a daughter to a man who might lose his property. She learned that Thomas's greatest fear wasn't poverty, but irrelevance, becoming one of the South's many failed planters who'd sold off and disappeared into obscurity. And she learned something more dangerous. Thomas was lonely. Not in the same way Hugh or Clayton were lonely. Thomas's isolation came from position. He had no peers at Bell Point, no one he could speak frankly with about doubts or fears. His managers were employees, his neighbors were competitors, his family was distant. In Rose, he'd accidentally found someone intelligent enough to understand his problems, but socially powerless enough that her knowing created no threat. Or so he thought. In early March, Rose made her boldest move yet. She was in Thomas's study reviewing crop projections when she said casually, "I've been thinking about your marriage prospects, sir." Thomas's head snapped up. "That's not appropriate discussion." "Forgive me," Rose said, not backing down. "But your financial situation affects everything at Bell Point. You need capital that you can't borrow. Marriage to wealth would solve problems that cotton can't. No respectable family will marry into a struggling plantation," Thomas said bitterly. "I've tried. Fathers want security for their daughters." "Then change what you're offering," Rose replied. "Stop trying to appear stable. Appear visionary instead. The Delta is changing. Railroads coming, new markets. The families with real money aren't looking for safe investments. They're looking for opportunities. You sell Bell Point not as a stable operation, but as a springboard to building something larger." Thomas considered this. "And how would I prove that vision?" "Reorganize everything, new systems, better documentation, professional accounting, innovations in production." Rose paused, and perhaps most importantly, demonstrate progressive thinking that appeals to the younger generation of wealthy families. Show you're not just another traditional planter. "Progressive thinking," Thomas repeated skeptically. "There are wealthy families in New Orleans, particularly among the Creoles, who have different views on certain social arrangements," Rose said carefully. She was walking the thinnest possible line. "They respect competence and innovation over rigid tradition. A plantation that demonstrates unusual efficiency, that shows a willingness to recognize ability regardless of conventional boundaries." She let the sentence hang. Thomas stared at her, understanding exactly what she was implying and not quite believing it. "You're suggesting I use you as evidence of progressive management." "I'm suggesting you use your results as evidence," Rose corrected. "This plantation's financial turnaround, whenever it's discussed, required unconventional decisions. That's attractive to unconventional wealth." Thomas stood and walked to the window, staring out at his property. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "That would be controversial only if unsuccessful," Rose replied. "Success transforms controversy into vision." Thomas didn't respond, but he didn't dismiss her either. Rose left that conversation knowing she'd planted a seed, but uncertain whether it would grow or poison the ground. What she didn't know was that her web of deceptions was beginning to unravel. Hugh had recently noticed Rose smelling like stable hay despite having no legitimate reason to visit that area. Samuel had found a ribbon he'd given Rose in the pocket of a coat that belonged to Martin. James's Bible had turned up in Clayton's cottage. Small inconsistencies were accumulating, and the 5 men who thought themselves uniquely connected to Rose were starting to question that assumption. The confrontation came on March 15, 1851, in a way Rose hadn't predicted. The 5 white managers arrived at Thomas's study together. Having compared their suspicions and discovered the truth, Rose was summoned from the kitchen where she'd been reviewing next month's supply orders. She entered to find Hugh, Samuel, James, Clayton, and Martin arranged in a semicircle facing Thomas's desk. Thomas sat behind it, looking thunderous. The atmosphere felt explosive. "These men have brought me disturbing information," Thomas said coldly. "They claim you've been having inappropriate relationships with all of them, simultaneously using them." Rose's mind raced through responses and rejected a dozen strategies in seconds. Denial would accomplish nothing. The men had clearly shared enough information to confirm the pattern. Contrition would be interpreted as admission of guilt, deserving punishment. Defense would sound like insolence. She had seconds to choose an approach that might conceivably avoid being sold downriver or worse. She chose honesty. Calculated partial honesty, but honesty nonetheless. "It's true," Rose said clearly. "I cultivated relationships with each of them deliberately and used those connections to gain knowledge, protection, and access I wouldn't otherwise have." The admission stunned them. Hugh's face flushed with anger. Samuel looked betrayed. James appeared stricken. Clayton seemed on the verge of tears. Martin's expression curdled into disgust. Thomas's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You admit to manipulation," Thomas said. "I admit to survival," Rose replied. "You brought me to Bell Point as property. I used every tool available to become something more. Is that evil, or is that what anyone with intelligence and will would do in my position? You seduced 5 men and played them against each other?" Hugh snarled. "I offered companionship to lonely men and learned from the access that provided." Rose corrected. "Each of you received exactly what you wanted. Hugh got comfort for his grief. Samuel got help achieving his dreams. James got spiritual companionship and absolution. Clayton got validation of his competence. Martin got recognition of his refinement. None of you were victims. You were men who made choices based on your desires, choices based on your lies." Martin spat, "based on your willingness to overlook conventional boundaries when it benefited you." Rose shot back, her voice hardening. "Each of you found ways to justify intimate relationships with someone you considered property when it served your emotional needs. The system you all profit from says I'm less than human. But you had no problem treating me as human enough for your beds, so who's really being dishonest here?" The silence that followed her words felt dangerous. Rose had crossed into territory enslaved people simply didn't occupy. Direct moral challenge to white authority. Such challenges typically ended in brutal punishment or sale. But Rose understood something about the men in this room. They'd already compromised themselves. Their outrage was rooted not in her actions, but in the mirror she'd held up to their own hypocrisies. Thomas spoke carefully. "You've created a situation that could destroy the working relationships necessary for this plantation to function. These men can barely look at each other right now. How do you propose to solve that?" "I don't," Rose said. "You do. You're the owner. Either you punish me to make them feel vindicated, which accomplishes nothing except making them feel briefly superior while I'm gone, and you lose someone who's been improving your finances, or you acknowledge that what happened reveals something uncomfortable about the system we all exist within, and you make a decision that serves your interests rather than their egos." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying Rose with fascination and calculation. "And what decision would serve my interests?" "Make me legitimate," Rose said. The room exploded in protests. Hugh cursed. Samuel shouted about impossibility. James quoted scripture about abomination. Clayton looked physically ill. Martin's face contorted with rage at the suggestion that someone he'd viewed as property might be elevated above him, but Thomas held up his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Rose's face. "Explain." "You need capital and credibility," Rose said, speaking quickly before the moment evaporated. "You need to appear visionary rather than desperate. Marry me." The suggestion was so outrageous that for several seconds nobody could formulate a response. In 1851, Mississippi interracial marriage was illegal, socially unthinkable grounds for violence and social destruction. What Rose was proposing couldn't happen, shouldn't happen, would never happen. Except Rose had spent months understanding Thomas Belmont, and she knew his greatest weakness wasn't lust or loneliness, but pragmatism taken to its logical extreme. Thomas valued efficiency over everything, and Rose was offering him an efficient solution to multiple problems. "It's illegal," Thomas said. Finally, in Mississippi, Rose replied, "Not everywhere. The marriage itself could occur elsewhere, documented with witnesses. You would control the information, reveal it strategically, frame it as progressive thinking, use it to attract families interested in innovation rather than tradition." "Nobody would accept it," Samuel said. "Some would," Rose countered. "Not most, but you don't need most. You need one wealthy family interested in supporting unconventional vision. They exist particularly in New Orleans among families with Caribbean connections where racial boundaries are more fluid. Families who'd see investment potential in a plantation demonstrating radical efficiency. You've thought this through." Thomas said, "I've thought through little else for months." Rose admitted, "This is my only path to freedom that doesn't require running and hiding for the rest of my life. And it's your only path to capital that doesn't require decades of debt." Thomas stood and walked to the window, staring out at Bell Point's fields. The 5 managers watched him with expressions ranging from horror to disbelief. Rose's heart hammered so hard she thought it might be audible, but she kept her expression neutral. Waiting. "Leave us," Thomas said finally. "Sir," Hugh questioned, "all of you out now." The 5 men filed out reluctantly, throwing backward glances filled with confusion and anger. When the door closed, Thomas turned to face Rose. "This is insane," he said flatly. "Yes," Rose agreed. "It would cost me most of my social standing. Temporarily, success restores status. It could get both of us killed, only if we're careless about who we tell and how we frame it." Thomas studied her for a long moment. "Why would I take this risk?" "Because you're already taking risks every day," Rose replied. "Your debts are crushing you. Traditional approaches aren't working. You need something radical to break through, and you're smart enough to recognize that unconventional problems sometimes require unconventional solutions. I'm offering you one, and what do you get? Freedom, legal personhood, the ability to live as something other than property." Rose's voice dropped. "The same things any human being wants." Thomas returned to his desk and sat heavily. "If I did this, and I'm not saying I will, how would it work?" Rose outlined the plan she'd been constructing for weeks. Travel to Ohio under the pretense of business, arrange a marriage there where interracial unions, while controversial, were legal, document everything carefully, return to Mississippi without immediate disclosure, use Rose's financial skills to turn Bell Point's fortunes decisively, approach specific wealthy families in New Orleans with investment proposals framed around innovative plantation management, only reveal the marriage when financial security made social controversy survivable. Thomas listened without interruption. When Rose finished, he sat silent for several minutes, thinking through implications and risks with the same methodical approach he applied to any major decision. "This could destroy me," he said finally. "Doing nothing will destroy you," Rose replied. "Just more slowly." Thomas looked at her with something approaching respect. "You're either brilliant or insane. Those aren't mutually exclusive," Rose said. Thomas almost smiled, then his expression hardened. "If I agree to this, you understand it's a business arrangement, not romance, not equality beyond what legal documentation provides." "I understand," Rose said. "I'm not asking for love. I'm asking for personhood." Thomas stood and extended his hand across the desk. "Then we have a deal." Rose shook his hand, feeling the strangeness of the gesture. A handshake between owner and owned, between white and black, between man and woman, a crossing of boundaries so fundamental that the act itself felt revolutionary. "When do we leave for Ohio?" Rose asked. 2 weeks, Thomas said. "I'll arrange the trip. You'll tell nobody." "Understood?" "Understood." Rose left Thomas's study and walked through Bell Point's halls in a daze. She'd done it. She'd manipulated, maneuvered, and gambled everything on a plan so audacious it shouldn't have worked. And somehow, against all odds and social laws, she'd convinced a plantation owner to marry the woman he'd purchased as property. But as Rose returned to the kitchen to resume her duties, she understood that the hardest part was still ahead. Converting a secret marriage into actual freedom would require navigating legal systems designed to prevent exactly what she'd accomplished. And the 5 men who now knew she'd manipulated them represented dangers that wouldn't simply disappear because Thomas had made a decision. The real test wasn't getting Thomas to agree. It was surviving what came after. Thomas and Rose traveled to Cincinnati in early April 1851, ostensibly on business related to cotton sales. The journey took 2 weeks by riverboat and rail, and they maintained complete discretion, traveling in separate accommodations, speaking only when necessary about business matters. Thomas traveled first class with other planters and merchants, discussing cotton markets and railroad investments. Rose traveled in quarters designated for free people of color, a liminal space between enslavement and full citizenship that existed in border states. She carried forged papers identifying her as a free woman, traveling north on business for her employer. Documents Thomas had arranged through contacts who asked no questions. The Mississippi River journey from Natchez to Cairo took 5 days, the steamboat churning against spring currents swollen with snowmelt. Rose spent those days observing other passengers, free black families moving north toward better opportunities, white families heading west toward new territories, traders and confidence men and prostitutes all mixed together in the democratic chaos of river travel. She studied their mannerisms, their speech patterns, their confident assumption of freedom. She practiced moving through the world as someone who owned herself, preparing for the transformation that awaited in Cincinnati. Thomas spent the same journey managing his own anxieties. He'd told his managers he was traveling north to negotiate better terms with cotton factors, which was partially true. He did intend to meet with merchants while in Ohio, but the primary purpose remained something he couldn't quite believe he was actually doing. In quiet moments on the deck, watching the river roll past, Thomas questioned his own sanity. He was risking everything: reputation, social standing, potentially his life on a scheme proposed by someone he'd purchased 16 months earlier. Yet, every time he examined the logic, he arrived at the same conclusion. Conventional approaches had failed, and Rose's plan offered possibilities that traditional paths didn't. In Cairo, they transferred to rail for the journey to Cincinnati. The train cars were segregated, and Rose rode in the colored section while Thomas occupied first class. The separation reinforced the strangeness of what they were about to do. Within days, they would be legally married, yet they couldn't sit in the same railroad car. The contradiction exemplified the fractured nature of American society in 1851, where freedom and bondage existed side by side, where state laws diverged wildly on fundamental questions of human rights and social organization. Cincinnati in April was a city of contradictions. Situated on the Ohio River's northern bank, it served as the unofficial border between slavery and freedom, between South and North. Southern planters conducted business there regularly, and the city's merchants profited enormously from the cotton trade. Yet, Cincinnati also housed a significant abolitionist community, underground railroad stations, and churches that openly defied the Fugitive Slave Act. It was precisely this contradiction that made the city useful for Thomas and Rose's purposes. Controversial arrangements could occur in Cincinnati that would be impossible in Mississippi. Finding a minister willing to perform an interracial marriage proved easier than Thomas had feared. The Quaker community in Cincinnati had performed such ceremonies before, viewing them as acts of conscience against unjust laws. Josiah Thornton, 72 years old with hands GNL'd by arthritis, but eyes still sharp, met with Thomas and Rose in his modest home near the church. He asked them direct questions about their intentions, their understanding of the difficulties they would face, their commitment to the marriage beyond its legal conveniences. "I've married 6 couples like yourselves," Thornton said, pouring tea in his simple kitchen, white and colored joining themselves in defiance of laws I consider ungodly. "But I ask you both, do you understand what you're creating? This isn't just a legal document. It's a statement that will follow you the rest of your lives. People will hate you for it. They'll call it abomination, perversion, proof of moral corruption. Are you prepared for that hatred?" Rose met his eyes steadily. "I've lived my entire life with people's hatred based on nothing but my birth. At least now the hatred will be for something I chose." Thomas was less certain. "I understand the risks. I'm not sure anyone can truly be prepared for them. But I'm willing to face consequences." Thornton nodded slowly. "Then I'll perform the ceremony. But I require one thing: honesty. Whatever your reasons for this marriage, whatever practical considerations drive it, you must speak your vows meaning them. I won't sanctify a pure business transaction. There must be genuine commitment to mutual welfare, to treating each other as partners rather than as property and owner, continuing their previous relationship under new labels. It was Rose who responded, "I commit to treating Thomas Belmont as my partner in building a life that neither of us could build alone. I commit to bringing every capability I possess to making our shared endeavors successful." "That's as genuine as any commitment can be," Thomas considered before speaking. "I commit to treating Rose as a person with rights, with agency, with authority over her own life. I commit to defending her personhood against any who would deny it. I commit to this partnership as something real, not just convenient." Thornton studied them both. "Then we'll proceed." The wedding occurred on April 14th in a small church on Cincinnati's outskirts. The building was simple. Whitewashed walls, plain wooden pews, no ornamentation beyond a simple cross above the altar. 2 local merchants served as witnesses in exchange for generous payment. Men who'd witnessed such ceremonies before and understood the value of discretion. One was a German immigrant named Weiss, who'd fled political persecution in Bavaria. The other was a free black man named Johnson, who operated a successful carpentry business. Both understood what it meant to exist outside conventional social categories. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes. Thornton read from Scripture the passage from Ruth about going where you go, lodging where you lodge, your people becoming my people. Rose appreciated the irony of words originally spoken by a Moabitette woman to her Israelite mother-in-law being applied to her own crossing of boundaries. When Thornton asked if they took each other as husband and wife, both answered yes clearly. When he pronounced them married under God's law and Ohio's civil law, Rose felt something shift inside her. Not love, not even affection particularly, but a fundamental reorientation of her relationship to the world. She was no longer property. She was a wife, a person, someone the law had to recognize. They signed the marriage certificate, Rose writing her name clearly, Thomas adding his signature below. The witnesses signed. Thornton recorded everything in his church registry, a book that contained dozens of controversial marriages performed over his long ministry. He provided them with signed and sealed documents, multiple copies for safekeeping. "Guard these carefully," he said. "They're evidence of your personhood now, but they're also evidence that could be used against you. Use them wisely." Thomas paid Thornton the agreed sum, plus additional money donated to the church's work, helping escaped slaves. Then he and Rose left separately. Thomas returning to his hotel, Rose to the boarding house where she'd been staying. They would maintain separation for the return journey, revealing nothing about what had occurred in that small church. The journey back to Mississippi took longer than the journey north. Thomas traveled directly, but Rose took a deliberately circuitous route designed to obscure timelines and prevent anyone from connecting her northern trip with Thomas's. She traveled through Indiana, then south through Kentucky, crossing back into Tennessee before finally reaching Mississippi in late April. During those weeks of travel, Rose experimented with her new identity. In some towns, she presented herself as a free woman of color traveling on business. In others, she reverted to the mannerisms of someone enslaved. She learned to shift between these identities fluidly, understanding that her survival would depend on knowing which face to wear in which circumstances. When Rose arrived back at Bell Point in late April, nothing appeared changed. She resumed work in the house and accounts office. Thomas treated her exactly as before in public, with professional respect when discussing business, with the formal distance appropriate between owner and skilled servant. The 5 managers, still angry and confused about the revelations from March, maintained professional distance, but took no action. Thomas had made clear that Rose remained under his protection, and challenging that would mean challenging him directly, something none of them were prepared to do while still employed at Bell Point. But everything had changed beneath the surface. Rose now worked the account books, not as an enslaved woman granted unusual privileges, but as a legally free person whose marriage gave her claim to partnership in Bell Point's operations. She couldn't reveal this status. Not yet. Not until circumstances made disclosure strategically advantageous. But the knowledge changed how she approached every task. She made decisions with the confidence of someone building her own future rather than merely surviving someone else's present. Thomas noticed the difference in her bearing, the subtle shift from calculating survival to calculating success, and found himself wondering whether he'd made a brilliant strategic move or an error that would eventually destroy him. Thomas began quietly restructuring Bell Point's operations using Rose's suggestions, implementing changes gradually enough that the managers wouldn't recognize a single dramatic shift, but would slowly realize the plantation ran more efficiently than before. Rose reorganized the account books completely, creating systems that tracked expenses and revenues with unprecedented precision. She identified waste in supply chains, negotiated better terms with merchants in Natchez, and restructured work assignments to maximize productivity without increasing hours. Within 2 months, the plantation's finances stabilized enough that Thomas could begin reaching out to potential investors, most notably the Duplessis family of New Orleans. The Duplessis family represented exactly the kind of unconventional wealth Thomas needed. Alexandre Duplessis had built his fortune through Caribbean sugar operations and Gulf Coast shipping before diversifying into cotton and banking. His family had Haitian roots, and his grandmother had been a free woman of color in New Orleans' complex racial hierarchy. Alexandre had married into white Creole society, but his family retained connections to communities that existed between rigid racial categories. They were wealthy enough that social conventions bent around them rather than the reverse, and they had reputations for supporting ventures others considered too risky or controversial. In July 1851, Thomas traveled to New Orleans to meet with Alexandre regarding potential investment in Bell Point. The meeting occurred in Alexandre's office in the French Quarter, a room lined with maps showing shipping routes and plantation holdings across 3 states. Thomas presented his case methodically: Bell Point's improved financial performance, its efficiency gains, its potential for expansion with additional capital. Alexandre listened politely, asked sharp questions about debt structures and crop projections, and seemed moderately interested but not convinced. Then Thomas revealed his marriage to Rose. He presented the documentation from Cincinnati, explained Rose's role in Bell Point's financial turnaround, and framed the marriage not as personal scandal, but as evidence of his willingness to recognize competence regardless of social convention. "I'm aware this will cost me standing among traditional planters," Thomas said, "but I'm not seeking traditional results. I'm seeking to build something that transcends conventional limitations." Alexandre studied the marriage certificate for several minutes in silence. Then he looked up at Thomas with an expression mixing amusement and calculation. "You understand most of Mississippi will view you as insane or immoral. I understand they'll view me as unsuccessful if I fail and visionary if I succeed." Thomas replied, "Success transforms controversy into innovation." Alexandre smiled. "I appreciate a man who understands that morality often follows money rather than the reverse." He stood and walked to his window overlooking the quarter's narrow streets. "What you've done is either brilliant or suicidal. Probably both, but it demonstrates exactly the kind of thinking I look for in investment opportunities: willingness to break rules when rules prevent optimal outcomes." He turned back to Thomas. "I'll invest $50,000 for 20% partnership, but I have conditions. First, you reveal this marriage strategically, not defensively. You control the narrative. Second, your wife, and I'll call her that since she legally is, she manages the accounts directly. If her competence drove these improvements, I want her competence managing my investment. Third, you free every enslaved person at Bell Point within 5 years and transition to paid labor. I won't invest in slavery long term. It's economically inefficient and politically unsustainable." Thomas hadn't expected the third condition. Freeing everyone would be exactly the kind of innovation that makes Bell Point truly visionary rather than merely scandalous, Alexandre interrupted. "Slavery is dying, Thomas. Maybe not this year or next, but it's dying. The question is whether planters adapt proactively or get crushed when the change comes. I invest in adaptation." Thomas agreed to all 3 conditions. The Duplessis capital stabilized Bell Point completely and funded expansions that increased production by 40% over the next year. Thomas's financial troubles ended. Rose's freedom became not just legal but defensible through economic success, and over the following 5 years, they gradually freed Bell Point's enslaved workers, transitioning to a paid labor system that proved, contrary to every assumption of Southern planters, that free workers motivated by wages could be more productive than enslaved workers motivated by punishment. The social consequences varied. Most of Mississippi society shunned Thomas completely when the marriage became public knowledge in late 1851. Neighboring planters refused to associate with someone who'd violated racial boundaries so fundamentally. Thomas received threatening letters, some promising violence, others merely promising eternal damnation. One former friend challenged him to a duel, which Thomas declined, understanding that dying for honor accomplished nothing. But a small circle of unconventional wealth, primarily from New Orleans and Caribbean-connected families, saw Thomas as visionary rather than deviant. That circle provided all the social and economic support Belle Point needed. Rose's experience was more complex. Among white Mississippi society, she simply ceased to exist. No one acknowledged her, spoke to her, or recognized her presence. But among free people of color in Natchez and New Orleans, she became a controversial figure. Some saw her as someone who'd achieved impossible freedom through intelligence and courage. Others viewed her as someone who'd collaborated with oppression rather than resisting it, who'd married into the system rather than fighting to destroy it. Rose understood both perspectives and refused to defend herself against either. She'd made her choices based on her own survival and freedom, and she wouldn't apologize for prioritizing her own liberation. Hugh Carpenter left Belle Point in August 1851, unable to reconcile his continued employment with his humiliation. He moved west to Arkansas, where he tried to establish himself as an overseer on cotton plantations along the Arkansas River, but his heart was never in the work. After leaving Mississippi, he drank more heavily, made poor decisions, alienated employers. He died in 1856 of fever in a rooming house in Little Rock, alone and largely forgotten. His final letter to a cousin mentioning Rose and expressing bewilderment that someone he'd considered property had outmaneuvered him so completely. Samuel Puigt stayed at Belle Point, rationalizing that his horse breeding work mattered more than social complications. Over the years, he developed a grudging respect for what Rose had accomplished, though he never spoke to her directly again. His breeding program succeeded. By the 1860s, Belle Point horses had reputations for strength and temperament that commanded premium prices. Samuel died in 1873, a modestly wealthy man, his obituary mentioning his contributions to horse breeding, but carefully omitting any reference to the unconventional plantation where he'd done his life's work. James Farley struggled with guilt for years after the revelation of Rose's manipulations in marriage. He continued working at Belle Point through 1852, but the cognitive dissonance between his religious beliefs and his participation in the plantation system became unbearable. He eventually left plantation work entirely to become a Methodist circuit preacher in Tennessee, traveling remote communities and preaching about redemption and forgiveness. He died in 1868 during a yellow fever epidemic. Still wrestling with the contradictions of his past, his final sermon reportedly about how humans rationalize participating in evil systems. Clayton Webb remained at Belle Point, his financial skills too valuable to replace despite his humiliation. He worked alongside Rose in the accounts office, maintaining professional courtesy but never recovering the relationship they'd had. Living with the knowledge that someone he'd seen as property had outmaneuvered him fundamentally damaged Clayton's self-conception. He became more withdrawn, more obsessive about accuracy in his ledgers, as if perfect accounting could restore order to a world that had revealed itself as far more chaotic than he'd believed. He died in 1879 of a stroke while reviewing quarterly accounts, his books immaculate to the end. Martin Jessup resigned immediately after Thomas's public announcement of his marriage, unable to tolerate his social world's inversion. He moved to Mobile, where he tried to reestablish himself in merchant society, but the story followed him. People whispered about the refined steward who'd been seduced and manipulated by an enslaved woman, and the whispers destroyed Martin's carefully constructed self-image. He died in 1858 of cholera during an epidemic that swept Mobile's waterfront. His final delirium reportedly filled with rambling accusations about Rose and betrayal. Rose Belmont lived the rest of her life in a strange liminal space, legally free, socially unacceptable, economically secure, but perpetually controversial. She never had children, a choice she and Thomas made together, understanding that mixed-race children born to their controversial union would face challenges neither wanted to inflict. She managed Belle Point's accounts until Thomas died in 1887 of heart failure, at which point she inherited the plantation outright, a provision Thomas had ensured in his will, despite knowing it would provoke legal challenges from distant relatives who claimed the inheritance was invalid. Rose fought those legal challenges successfully, hiring lawyers from New Orleans who argued that her marriage was legal where it occurred and that Mississippi had no grounds to invalidate contracts made in other states. The case took 3 years to resolve, but ultimately Rose's ownership was confirmed. She sold Belle Point in 1888 for a sum that made her independently wealthy. The plantation's value had increased enormously under her management, and the buyer was a northern investment company interested in modernized agricultural operations. With the money from the sale, Rose moved to France, where racial attitudes, while hardly enlightened, permitted a kind of anonymity Mississippi never would. She lived in Paris in an apartment on the left bank, existing in expatriate communities that included writers, artists, and others who'd left America for various reasons. She never remarried. She occasionally gave interviews to journalists interested in America's racial complexities, but she spoke carefully, revealing little about her methods or motivations. She died in Paris in 1904 at age 73. Her obituary in French newspapers described her as an American aise of mysterious background who'd lived quietly in Paris for over a decade. Her obituary in Mississippi papers, when they mentioned her at all, called her a cautionary tale about the South's defeated past, a symbol of how the old order had been corrupted and destroyed. The court documents survive. The Cincinnati marriage certificate with Josiah Thornton's signature. The Belle Point account books filled with Rose's precise handwriting. Thomas's will naming her as heir with extensive provisions explaining his reasoning. The property transfer documents when she sold the plantation. The legal briefs from her inheritance fight. Historians debate the implications endlessly. Some see Rose as a manipulator who used immoral means to achieve her ends, who exploited vulnerable men and violated social codes that, however unjust, maintained order. Others see her as a brilliant strategist who exploited the hypocrisy of a system designed to deny her humanity, who used the only tools available to someone in her position to achieve freedom. Most agree she accomplished something that should have been impossible. She took a world structured to deny her every form of power and remade herself into someone who controlled her own fate. She entered Belpino's property, valued at $800, and left as Rose Belmont, owner of 200 acres and 37 human beings. She immediately freed before the sale. Whether that transformation makes her admirable or disturbing depends entirely on which values you prioritize, the rigid social codes she violated or the fundamental human drive for freedom she demonstrated. Quarter CT. A final. This story reveals how one woman navigated impossible circumstances through intelligence, manipulation, and calculated risk-taking that changed not just her own life, but the structure of an entire plantation. What do you think of Rose's methods? Were her manipulations justified by her circumstances, or did her tactics make her as morally compromised as the system she fought against? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing different perspectives on these complex historical figures. If you found this tale compelling and want more stories about people who changed their fates against overwhelming odds, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who appreciates morally complex historical narratives. And remember, history is rarely as simple as heroes and villains. Most people exist in the complicated spaces between. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the shadows of America's past.